thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here on this topic because it's interesting and it's timely and relevant. So what I'd like to do is to talk about EU-China relations in general, actually, in the current world state of affairs. I'd like to go more into green and circular economy as a response to today's challenges, give an overview, short, over EU and Chinese initiatives on green and circular economy, and then make the case to provide the rationale for a closer partnership between the EU and China on green economy. And then I will also mention the role of the UN, what we could do from our side to help this happen. So I represent the UN environment here. We have a small office located in the UN House. Altogether, there are about 20 plus UN organizations represented in Brussels, and we are one of them, UN Environment, the voice on the environment in the UN system. What we do is we provide leadership and partnership for the environment by trying to inspire, inform, and assist in particular countries, but also peoples and stakeholders to improve the quality of life, basically without compromising that of future generations. We do this in partnerships with governments, with the private sector, civil society, and other UN entities, and international organizations. And we do have a very strong partnership with the EU, which is a core supporter of the UN environment, both politically and financially. And our partnership with China is developing now as well, very fast, with a number of flagship initiatives, including a large project actually on green economy called PAGE, Partnership Action on Green Economy. This is a program spanning many countries in the world and now also China. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So where do we stand then now in terms of the global state of affairs, and how does EU and China fit into it? Well, there are many ways to describe that, but I'd like to start with a quote from President Xi Jinping at the Davos Economic Forum. It was a very interesting speech, and I recommend reading it. He said, "It's important to protect the environment while pursuing economic and social progress." That's an important statement, obviously. But he also said the Paris Agreement is a hard-won achievement, and all signatories should stick to it rather than walk away. So he said this while we are somehow walking into a new era. Some might call it the Trump era, but it goes beyond that. Somehow an era of fear and uncertainty. This is despite the fact that, in fact, globally, people are richer, healthier and safer than at any time in history, actually. Since 2005, over 500 million people have escaped from extreme poverty and hunger, and many of them actually in China. Today we have less than 10% of the world population, which is still, of course, too high figure, in extreme poverty. This is an all-time low. So nevertheless, we see in media, social media, also some politicians, they paint a very different picture, perception that is different, that drives fear, hopelessness and despair. It fuels populism, extreme nationalism and xenophobia, and eventually those fears might themselves make the world poorer and more unsafe. This is true in the EU, certainly in the US. Maybe it's also true in China. I don't know what is the public perception there of where things are going. But it's also true. We live somehow, part of it's true in terms of uncertainty. We do live in an era of uncertainty. We are somehow still recovering from the financial crisis. The financial system has not been fixed, although everybody recognized that it has been broken. The economic gap between rich and poor is widening. Also, the power gap between the so-called elites and those who feel powerless and sometimes are powerless and left behind, that gap is also growing. And of course, the global population is growing. Expected to reach somewhere around 10 billion by 2050 from 7.2 today. So that's 2.5 billion or so people added between 2015 and 2050. Most of them in Africa, interestingly. So if you look at what this means, it corresponds, for example, to 70% more food needed by 2050, also because of higher affluence, just as one example. And in the same time, we see inequality within countries and also between, but certainly within, increasing, with 70% of the world's population living in countries where inequality has increased over the last 2 decades. So this clearly will lead to instability if it's not tackled. Then the pressures on the renewable and finite resources will increase. There's no doubt about that. Unless, I should say, resource efficiency is substantially improved. I think this point is still not debated enough on the world scene. It's not taken seriously enough. Just to give you a few examples, planetary boundaries have been passed for climate change, the nitrogen cycle, and biodiversity, meaning we are already beyond what the planet can absorb. In a business-as-usual scenario, the global use of metals, biomass, minerals, and, for example, sand and other materials will increase from 85 billion tons per year today to 186 billion tons by 2050. So it's more than doubling the kind of material consumption that we use. And we can't, I think, even begin to understand what that would actually mean in practice in terms of disturbance to the world economy, but also, of course, to environmental degradation and health. In urban areas, which is 1% of the Earth's land area, we have now 50% of the world's population, and this is going to grow to 67% by 2050. Wildlife, just to mention another example, wildlife populations in 40 years have declined by half. Looking at health, environmental causes now are linked to 25% of the world's total disease burden and mortality, with urban air pollution set to become the main environmental cause of premature death globally. Looking at raw materials, 20 countries in the world, one of them China, supplies 90% of the world's critical raw materials. China has a special role also as to produce raw materials for electronics, for example, rare earth metals and minerals, and also for low carbon or green economy technologies. So China has a very important role there to play as well. So all of these factors mentioned now, they also drive an unprecedented level of migration around the world, puts additional pressure on our democracy, and again, it fuels extreme right populism, xenophobia, short-termism, etc. So in this context, closer cooperation between the UN, well, the UN as well, but the EU and China, supported by the UN, on climate change and green economy is probably more relevant than ever. Globalization cannot, probably should not be stopped, but it has to be managed better than we do today. And we need to do that through international rule-based and fair economic, social, environmental safeguards. So how do we best address these challenges? Well, the global and multilateral response is pretty clear. This has been supported by both President Juncker and most EU leaders, if not all of them, and President Xi Jinping. At the core, we have the 2030 agenda, a kind of universal master plan agreed by all countries to address these challenges in an integrated and holistic way. It also provides actually a positive narrative, which is rare today, rather than a narrative of fear, that appeals to all citizens around the world and that can make a positive difference. It's a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity, adopted in September 2015 with a time frame of 2016 to 2030. And it consists of a declaration. I recommend reading it. It's not as boring as you might think. this UN language. It's actually quite inspiring, this Agenda 2030 declaration. It has 17 sustainable development goals, 169 targets to provide some concretion to those 17 goals, and 250 or so indicators now being developed to monitoring process. And there's a means of implementation and a renewed global partnership around it. It's all based on the need to work together. National solutions simply will not work. We have to do this together, regionally and globally. It provides, compared to the previous Millennium Development Goals, a higher level of ambition, a new way of decision making, a transformational agenda rather than an incremental one. And it's a universal agenda for all countries, which is also new. It's not only for the developing world. In fact, all countries are developing countries these days because no country is sustainable. It applies an integrated approach to development, and it has a wider scope, going beyond the traditional development agenda, economic growth first, to include environment, governance, peace, human rights, etc. And it relies on a global partnership. The EU and China will have to provide leadership to this process, otherwise it will fail. I think they both have a very crucial role to play, and ideally together. Then we have the Paris Agreement as well, another major breakthrough. So on the one hand, we have the universal global action plan for the planet, the 2030 agenda, and then we have the specific one on climate change. There is now full scientific consensus on climate change, and it's questioned only on political grounds in a few quarters, you know which ones. We see also investments in renewable energy at all-time high, not only in the developed world. In fact, it's more now in the so-called developing world. Renewable energy is becoming cheaper than fossil fuels, and investments are higher. Interestingly, investments globally are going down in renewable energy, but the capacity is going up. So this is a clear sign that it's becoming cheaper. So we are also looking at probably quite major technological breakthroughs on ICT, electrification. There's somehow a trade dispute, I think, sailing up between the EU and China, in fact, on electric cars. It's interesting. There has been also discussions on wind turbines and solar. These are difficult talks, but it's very interesting to see this kind of competition between two of the world's leading economic powers on green tech, basically. And in some ways, I think it's a healthy competition, although it's difficult to sort out politically and by trade standards. We still have many problems with stranded assets and investments, especially on new coal plants still being built today. Of course, these will function for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and that is a problem. And also, in the long run, we cannot really avoid looking also not only at technological issues, but also lifestyle issues. This is not really debated today. Nobody really dares to go too much into that, but we have to do that if we are to succeed on both of these agendas, the 2030 agenda and the Paris agenda. This has to do with what we eat, what we consume, how much energy we use, etc. So the green and circular economy, this is somehow a response to many of these challenges. How do we go about it? There are many promising examples and initiatives, but for a paradigm shift, we really need an economic system that supports change and doesn't work against it. It is happening somehow, but it's too slow. The 2030 agenda and the Paris are probably the most advanced plans we've seen ever. But countries are in the lead, and the question is, do our political leaders and our business leaders, are they clear enough? Are they bold enough? Are they wise enough? And are they capable? Well, probably it's fair to say not yet, and one reason is that the global economic system is not well designed to support it. In fact, it's undermining it. It's stimulating overconsumption, it's widening gaps between rich and poor, it's promoting short-termism and speculation. For example, we talk about the 100 billion for the Green Climate Fund. It sounds like a lot, and it is challenging to reach, but We need trillions, not billions, in green investments. The Paris Agreement alone is estimated to require some 16.5 trillion in investment between 2015 and 2030. We also need the IMF, WTO, development banks, big private investment companies to support this transition, as well as government subsidies and tax systems. Green economy must be at the core of any future political visions, including, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the future of the EU, which is also now at stake. What is the EU going to be in 10, 15, 20 years? We don't really know, but whatever it does, it has to be based on sustainability and green economy or circular economy. What is then green and circular economy, low carbon economy, low emission economy? There's a lot of concepts out there. Many names for one approach. In fact, there is no internationally agreed definition of any of this. The UN Environment definition of green economy is an economy that results in improved human well-being and social equity, while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. An economy that is low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. But I think we should keep it simple. It's really about increasing economic output while at the same time decreasing the use of energy and resources and cutting down pollution. So this will require new technology and innovation, but we also have to look at lifestyle aspects of this. Some practical examples of what this means. Well, we have the idea of a tax shift. It's still equally relevant to move the tax burden from labor to resource and energy use. We have the issue of subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies in particular. If we take those out, if we remove them, this can reduce alone global CO2 emissions by more than 20%. And if we, for example, introduce a carbon tax in China, we have looked at the science behind this in UN Environment, it could reduce CO2 emissions by 20% in China by 2030. And it could save close to 4 million lives by discouraging the use of coal with the health problems that has. You can also green national budgets, obviously. You can have reformed pricing systems for energy, water, land use, discouraging overuse. And you can give economic values to free public goods such as nature, biodiversity, clean air, for example, or water. You can have an employment policy that stimulates green jobs. Renewable energy already employs 1.1 million people in the EU and 3.5 million people in China. In the US, in parenthesis, it employs 800,000 people. The coal industry, less than 5 times lower than that, around 180,000. So when President Trump talks about saving jobs by saving the coal industry, it simply doesn't make sense. Quick overview, and we'll see more about what the EU and China does later in the day. You know about the EU's strong commitment to circular economy and climate change. There's a strong commitment to the 2030 agenda, a strong legally binding climate policy. There's the 7th Environmental Action Program, providing a very strong basis on policy. There's the circular economy package, a clean air package, a recent energy package, the resource efficiency strategy within the EU 2020 agenda. There's the EU climate diplomacy strategy, reaching out to the rest of the world. There's a 20% climate change spending requirement in the EU budget. The EU ODA supports climate change measures in third countries. And there's a covenant of mayors, for example, where I think also now China is participating on climate and energy. That's just a very quick sum up, and we'll hear more about that, I think, later. China also has stepped up its climate and green economy leadership in the past few years. In 2014, the People's Bank of China established a Green Finance Task Force, supported by UN Environment, to develop recommendations for a comprehensive program to reform and enhance market information, to strengthen legal framework, fiscal incentives, and institutional design. There was a G20 summit in Hangzhou. Is that how you...
Hangzhou?
Hangzhou?
Yes.
Is that how you
Yes.
pronounce it? Hangzhou. There was a final communique there that highlights green finance and as an effective means to support global sustainable growth. And this builds on a G20 Green Finance Study Group, which is a Chinese initiative co-chaired by the People's Bank of China and supported by UN Environment again. There are 7 Chinese government ministries jointly released guidelines for establishing the green financial system, laying out action plans on how China can green its financial system. There's a circular economy promotion law from 2009 designed to facilitate circular economy, raising resource utilization rates, and protecting and improving the environment. There's a partnership for action on green economy project, which I mentioned, where we are supporting that project from UN Environment. It has launched its first local green economy promotion project in Jiangsu.
Yes.
In 2015 on green planning, regulations and policies with ecological red lines, interesting concept, to protect ecological functions for more than 20% of the territory, and a green development evaluation system for assessing green performance of 13 municipalities. So this is already considered a success, and it's now being scaled up to other parts of China and to go deeper in Jiangsu. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll just come back to that at the end of my presentation, which is soon. But to say that, again, this is a mega project, a mega vision in a way. UN Environment is gearing up to support it to make sure that it has strong environmental safeguards. So together these actions can in fact be said to represent a kind of new vision for green economy by the Chinese government. There are a couple of examples of existing China cooperation, EU-China cooperation on green economy. There's a cooperation on the emission trading system, for example, which is now being developed in China with EU support. There are emission limit standards for vehicles. The Euro standards, I believe, are used in China. So they were developed in the EU, but now useful also for the Chinese regulatory system. There's the Covenant of Mayors, as I mentioned, open to Chinese cities as well. And China is, in fact, providing technical solutions on many of these challenges through trade, on wind and solar, for example. But as I mentioned, this is also an area of contention because it challenges EU competitiveness. So, wrapping up, I would say that the rationale for an even closer or a much closer partnership between the EU and China on green economy is very significant. If they can team up on green economy, this creates somehow a win-win-win situation. Win for the EU, for China, and for the planet, actually. The EU is already reaching out to Asia since many years, and vice versa. We have the US-America first approach, which I think creates a new momentum, probably for even closer ties between the EU and China. It is already, EU and China is already one of the world's biggest and most dynamic trading relationships. I think China is the EU's second largest trading partner, 20% of imports, 10% of exports. So very significant. Their agendas seem to be converging with many common aims on multilateralism, trade, stability, climate change, the 2030 agenda as well. And there's a strong institutional basis already in place. We have the EU-China summit coming up. We have the Asia-Europe meeting, ASEM meeting. We have the EU-China partnership on climate change, a high-level political framework to reduce energy intensity of economies. There's the China-EU 2020 strategic agenda for cooperation, which recognizes green growth as an area of strategic and practical China-EU cooperation. And there are bilateral trade deals with both China and other ASEAN countries. There's the ASEAN cooperation as well, where China plays and the EU plays an important role. And there is the Belt and Road Initiative. And just to say a few words about that, it looks somehow promising also for climate action and green economy. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there to make sure that this is actually true. It needs very strong political guidance from China as well as other countries and the EU to make really sure that this is not just another infrastructure project, but that it has very strong environmental and social safeguards. UN Environment has committed to support China and the other countries to make sure that this is the case. So in summary, the final messages I would have, 4 of them. First of all, we don't start from zero. There is already some cooperation going on. However, the opportunity to do more is really significant. Given the challenges we face globally and with the current world state of affairs, the arguments for closer cooperation in this area is really very, very strong. Closer cooperation between the EU and China on green economy would not only mean, it wouldn't only be a bonus, but it's actually a necessity, I think, that will create this win-win-win situation. Thirdly, there are many possible avenues to make this happen, including the EU-China Climate Partnership, the EU-China summits, obviously, and perhaps also under this new Belt and Road Initiative. And fourthly, this doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It will require hard work on both sides, very clear and very strong strategic thinking and leadership, and also a spirit of compromise, of course. There will be a win-win, but also, in some cases, some interests, some sectors might lose out. So we have to consider that. The UN Environment and other UN organizations can assist in this process. We have the convening power, we have some of the know-how, and we can share also the best practices.
Well, thank you. That's